On the edge of a quiet neighborhood, a scruffy brown dog named Max roamed freely. Max wasn't just any dog. He had a knack for finding things that were out of place. From an abandoned shoe to a missing garden gnome, Max was the neighborhood's unofficial detective. But lately, his behavior puzzled everyone. Each day, like clockwork, Max wandered to the corner of Willow Street. He'd sit by the rusty saw hatch, his ears perked up and his nose twitching. He sniffed the air, circled the hatch, and then sat quietly, staring down at the metal cover as if expecting something, or someone. His intense focus was unusual, even for him. At first, the neighbors didn't pay much attention. Dogs were dogs. After all, they dug holes, barked at shadows, and occasionally fixated on random objects. But as the days turned into weeks, Max's obsession became impossible to ignore. Rain or shine, Max was there, his tail wagging gently, his eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and concern. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman who lived closest to the saw, began to worry. Maybe he hears something, she told her husband. What if there's an animal trapped down there? Her husband shrugged it off, but the doubt lingered in her mind. Word spread quickly. Children playing in the streets began to follow Max to the saw, whispering wild theories about treasure, monsters, or hidden tunnels. Their parents warned them not to go near the hatch, but even the adults couldn't help but feel a twinge of curiosity. What could possibly be down there? One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Max's behavior shifted. Instead of sitting quietly, he backed, loud and sharp. He pawed at the hatch, his nails scraping against the metal. The sound was unsettling, almost desperate. Mrs. Thompson, watching from her window, felt a chill run down her spine. Something's not right, she muttered to herself. Little did they know, Max's instincts were about to uncover a truth that would shake the entire neighborhood. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Max's peculiar antics had become the talk of the town. Did you hear about the dog in the saw? A man asked his co-worker at the coffee shop. Apparently, he's been at it for weeks, the other replied. The story spread like wildfire, gaining details and exaggerations with each retelling. By midday, a small crowd had gathered around the saw hatch. Children pointed and giggled, while adults speculated wildly. Maybe it's a gas leak, one man suggested. Or a lost cat, another chimed in. A few skeptics rolled their eyes, dismissing the whole thing as nonsense. But even they couldn't deny the strange pull of the scene. Max was there, of course, sitting proudly by the hatch as if guarding a secret. His presence only added to the mystery. Every so often, he'd tilt his head, listening intently. It was as if he could hear something no one else could. Mrs. Thompson decided to take matters into her own hands. Armed with a flashlight and a long stick, she approached the hatch. "I'm going to check it out," she announced. The crowd watched in anticipation as she knelt down, peering into the gaps around the edges. She tapped the metal with her stick, but the sound that echoed back was hollow and eerie. "Maybe we should call the city," someone suggested. But Mrs. Thompson shook her head. "Not yet. Let's see if we can figure this out first." Deep down, she felt an unshakable sense of foreboding. It wasn't just curiosity that drove her, it was fear. As the sun began to set, the crowd dispersed, leaving Mrs. Thompson alone with Maximum. "What are you trying to tell us, boy?" she whispered, scratching behind his ears. Max responded with a soft whine, his eyes never leaving the hatch. Whatever was down there, it was waiting. That night, a storm rolled in. Rain poured down in sheets, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Most of the neighborhood stayed indoors, but Max refused to leave the saw. Even as lightning lit up the sky, he remained steadfast, his fur soaked and his eyes unwavering. Around midnight, a faint sound broke through the noise of the storm. It was subtle at first, almost indistinguishable, a soft tapping, like fingernails on metal. Max's ears shot up, and he barked furiously, his voice cutting through the darkness. Mrs. Thompson, unable to sleep, heard the commotion. Grabbing her raincoat, she hurried outside. "What is it, Max?" she called, her voice trembling. But as she approached the hatch, she heard it too. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, and unmistakably human. Panic surged through her. "Is someone down there?" she shouted, her voice barely audible over the storm. But there was no reply, only the relentless tapping. Mrs. Thompson ran back to her house and called the police. "There's something, or someone, in the sewer," she told the dispatcher. "You need to come right away." The urgency in her voice left no room for doubt. By the time the police arrived, a small crowd had gathered despite the rain. Flashlights illuminated the area as officers inspected the hatch. Max barked excitedly, circling the scene. "It's probably just an animal," one officer muttered. But when they pried open the hatch, the truth was far more horrifying. A deep, foul smell wafted up from the darkness, making everyone recoil. The officer shone his flashlight into the opening, revealing a narrow tunnel filled with stagnant water and debris. And then they saw it, a small hand, pale and lifeless, reaching up from the shadows. Gasps and cries erupted from the crowd. "Oh my God!" someone screamed. Mrs. Thompson clutched her chest, tears streaming down her face. The officers sprang into action, calling for backup and setting up barricades. Max stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the hand. For the first time, he let out a low, mournful howl that sent shivers down everyone's spine. Rescue teams arrived within minutes, equipped with ropes, harnesses, and breathing apparatuses. The air was thick with tension as they descended into the sewer, guided by the faint sound of tapping that had now grown weaker. The crowd watched in silence, their breath held as the rescuers disappeared into the darkness. Time seemed to stretch endlessly until finally, a voice crackled over the radio. "We found her. She's alive." Cheers and tears erupted from the crowd as the rescuers emerged, carrying a frail, shivering girl no older than 8. Her clothes were torn, her face smudged with dirt, but she was alive. The girl clung to Max, who licked her face gently, his tail wagging for the first time in weeks. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The little girl, wrapped in a warm blanket provided by the rescue team, trembled as she clung tightly to Maximum. Her eyes darted around the crowd, as if searching for something or someone. The neighborhood stood frozen in silence, their shock and relief palpable. Who was this child? And how did she end up trapped in the sewer? "Sweetheart, what's your name?" asked one of the paramedics softly. But the girl didn't answer. She buried her face into Max's fur, her small frame shaking with silent sobs. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her motherly instincts kicking in. "Let her rest," she said gently, her voice firm yet kind. "She's been through enough." The paramedics nodded, guiding the girl to the ambulance while Max trotted faithfully beside her. As the ambulance doors closed, whispers erupted among the crowd. "Who is she? How did she get down there? Where are her parents?" The questions swirled like the remnants of the storm, but no one had any answers. Later that evening, the police revealed a chilling detail. "There's no missing person report matching her description," Officer Peterson informed the neighborhood. "It's like she appeared out of nowhere." Meanwhile, at the hospital, the little girl finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but her words sent a shiver down the nurse's spine. "He's still down there," she said, "and is angry." The next day, the neighborhood was in a frenzy. News vans lined the streets, reporters clamoring for interviews. Everyone wanted to know about the mysterious girl and the heroic dog who had found her. But amidst the chaos, something darker brewed. Mrs. Thompson, unable to shake the girl's haunting words, decided to visit the hospital. She brought Max along, hoping his presence would comfort the child. When she arrived, the girl's room was quiet, except for the steady beeping of the monitors. The girl's eyes lit up when she saw Max, and she reached out for him. "You're back," she whispered, a faint smile crossing her lips. Max licked her hand, his tail wagging softly. Mrs. Thompson sat beside her. "Sweetheart, can you tell us your name?" she asked gently. The girl hesitated, then whispered, "Lila." "That's a beautiful name," Mrs. Thompson said with a warm smile. "Lila, can you tell me what happened? How did you end up in the sewer?" Tears welled up in Lila's eyes as she clung to Maximum. "I wasn't alone," she said. "There's a man down there. He told me not to leave." Mrs. Thompson's heart skipped a beat. "A man? What man?" Lila shook her head, her small hands trembling. "He's not a man anymore," she said. "He's something else." That evening, Mrs. Thompson couldn't sleep. Lila's words echoed in her mind, filling her with dread. Desperate for answers, she turned to the only place she knew she might find them, the town archives. The archives were located in an old building near City Hall, filled with dusty files and forgotten records. Mrs. Thompson explained the situation to the clerk, who reluctantly allowed her access to the older documents. Hours passed as she sifted through files about the neighborhood's history. Most of it was mundane: construction permits, land disputes, old photographs. But then she found it, a series of newspaper clippings from the 1950s detailing a string of disappearances. According to the articles, several children had gone missing near Willow Street over the course of a decade. The cases were never solved, but one detail stood out. All the disappearances were near the same sewer hatch where Max had found Lila. One article mentioned a name: Walter Griggs, a reclusive man who had worked as a maintenance worker for the city's sewer system. He was questioned by police but never charged. Shortly after the investigations, Walter disappeared, and the case went cold. Mrs. Thompson's hands trembled as she pieced the story together. Was Walter still down there, somehow? And if so, what had he become? Determined to uncover the truth, Mrs. Thompson approached Officer Peterson with her findings. At first, he was skeptical, but the old records couldn't be ignored. A search team was assembled to investigate the sewer system once more. Max insisted on joining, barking furiously when they tried to leave him behind. Finally, the team relented, allowing the brave dog to lead the way. The air inside the sewer was damp and foul, the walls slick with moss. The team moved cautiously, their flashlights casting long shadows. Max walked ahead, his nose to the ground, his body tense. After several minutes, they came to a fork in the tunnel. Max stopped, his ears twitching. He backed once, then turned to the right, leading them deeper into the darkness. Suddenly, one of the team members froze. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Everyone fell silent. A faint sound echoed through the tunnel. Tap, tap, tap. The same rhythmic tapping Lila had described. The team pressed on, their nerves on edge. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. And then they saw it. A figure crouched in the shadows, its face obscured. The figure turned slowly, revealing hollow eyes and a twisted smile. "Welcome," it rasped. The team froze in terror as a figure stepped forward. It was Walter Griggs, or what was left of him. His skin was pale and stretched tightly over his bones, his movements unnatural and jerky. Max growled, his fur bristling. He lunged at Walter, barking ferociously. The distraction gave the team enough time to act. "We need to get out of here," one of them shouted. As they turned to flee, Walter let out an inhuman scream, his voice echoing through the tunnels. The walls seemed to vibrate, debris falling from the ceiling. The team scrambled through the tunnels, Max leading the way. Just as they reached the exit, the ground shook violently. The sewer hatch slammed shut behind them, trapping whatever lurked inside. The team collapsed on the pavement, gasping for air. Max stood proudly, his tail wagging as if to say, "We made it." But Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Walter's parting words echoed in her mind. This isn't the end. The rescue team and the neighbors gathered outside the sewer, their faces pale with fear and disbelief. The story of Walter Griggs had become a grim reality, and the neighborhood felt the weight of the dark secrets hidden beneath their streets. Max, the hero of the day, sat calmly by Mrs. Thompson's side. She petted his head, whispering, "You knew all along, didn't you?" His tail wagged softly in response. The police sealed off the sewer hatch, declaring it unsafe. "We'll send a specialized team to investigate further," Officer Peterson assured the crowd. But there was an unspoken understanding among the neighbors. No one wanted to go back down there. Lila, still shaken but safe, had been taken to a foster home temporarily while authorities worked to piece together her story. She refused to say much more about her time in the sewer, only that Walter had trapped her but hadn't hurt her. He was waiting, she whispered to a social worker, waiting for someone else. The haunting word spread unease through the neighborhood. What did Walter mean by someone else? Mrs. Thompson, unable to let go of the mystery, delved deeper into the archives and old police records. She learned that Walter Griggs had been an outcast even before the disappearances. Rumors swirled about his obsession with the sewer system and his belief that something ancient and powerful lurked beneath the town. One file contained Walter's personal journal, found in his abandoned home years after he vanished. The entries were erratic, filled with sketches of the sewer tunnels and cryptic notes about voices and shadows. One chilling passage stood out. "They call to me. They demand a child. Only then will they leave us in peace." Mrs. Thompson realized the truth. Walter wasn't the source of the evil. He had been a pawn, a man driven to madness by something far darker. And if he had been waiting for someone else, it meant the threat wasn't over. That night, Mrs. Thompson couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, staring at the sealed sewer hatch illuminated by the dim street lights. Max lay at her feet, his ears twitching as if sensing her unease. Suddenly, Max bolted upright, barking furiously at the window. Mrs. Thompson rushed to the door, her heart pounding. She flung it open and froze. The hatch was ajar. She grabbed a flashlight and hurried outside, Max by her side. As she approached the hatch, a gust of cold air hit her, carrying a foul stench. Max growled low, his eyes fixed on the dark opening. A soft whisper reached her ears. "It's not over." Terrified, Mrs. Thompson called the police, who arrived quickly and sealed the hatch again, this time welding it shut. But deep down, she knew it was a temporary fix. Whatever lurked beneath the town was still there, and it was waiting. The neighborhood came together in the days that followed, determined to protect their town. They formed a committee to oversee the sewer investigation, working closely with the authorities. Engineers and historians were brought in to map the tunnels and understand their history. Mrs. Thompson became a local hero, praised for her courage and determination. But she deflected the attention, insisting that Max was a true hero. "Without him, we'd have never found Lila," she told reporters. Max became a symbol of hope and resilience, his story inspiring people far beyond the neighborhood. Despite the efforts to move forward, an unspoken fear lingered. The townsfolk avoided the corner of Willow Street, and children were warned to stay far away from the sewer. The neighborhood had changed forever, its innocence lost. Months passed, and life began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The sewer was permanently sealed, and Lila found a loving family willing to adopt her. But Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't truly over. One evening, she sat on her porch with Max, watching the sunset. She decided to share the story with the world, hoping to raise awareness about the dangers lurking in forgotten places. She recorded a heartfelt video, holding Max close as she spoke. "Hello, everyone. My name is Margaret Thompson, and this is Max, the bravest dog you'll ever meet. Together, we uncovered a terrifying secret beneath our neighborhood. A story that reminds us to listen to the world around us, even when it speaks in whispers." She recounted the events, her voice trembling with emotion. "This isn't just about what we found. It's about what we learned. To trust our instincts, to stand together as a community, and to protect the vulnerable." As the video neared its end, she leaned closer to the camera. "I need your help. Share this story, not just to remember what happened, but to encourage others to pay attention to their surroundings. Look out for each other, and if you see something strange, don't ignore it. It could save a life." Max barked softly, as if echoing her sentiment. "Thank you for listening," she said, her voice steady. "And remember, sometimes the smallest voices, like Max's, are the ones that matter most." What would you have done in Mrs. Thompson's situation? Comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who loves a good mystery or needs a reminder to trust their instincts. Let's keep this conversation going. Together, we can make our community safer for everyone.